All right, so I'm going to start off first off with a video, a breakdown video of basically why climate change is such a hot topic for globalists or if you want to call multinational corporations, elites, whatever your name is for them. Um, I'm going to go ahead and play this video for you guys so that you get a better understanding. Let me see if I can. What is happening?
I'm going to give you is a very objective one. We need to recognize that many people who are supporting the Paris Accords, if you ask them, why should we have been in this, give me one benefit, no one can really give any benefit. In fact, I haven't had anyone rationally explain even one benefit. What I'm going to explain to you very quickly here so everyone can understand in very simple ways is why it was important that Donald Trump got out of this, why it was essentially going to support an international collusion to basically support the polluting of our environment, and more importantly, to basically tax all of us, businesses, small businesses, big businesses, primarily a lot of small businesses, and every consumer here with a carbon tax. And it's a very simple exposition of this, and I hope I make it clear to you. And obviously, if you have questions, we're periscoping, you're welcome to join us. First of all, let me explain something very basic here. So in this circle, let's consider the fact that we have a lot of businesses here. These are businesses throughout the world. And these businesses, are producing different things. And let's assume these are typically manufacturing businesses. They take resources, raw materials, they process stuff, and out comes products from these businesses, which typically go to the consumer. A lot of consumers here, this is, you and me over here. And we buy these products and we pay this company some dollar amount. Now, many of these companies, because of the manufacturing process, do put out carbon and CO2 into the environment. Let's call that broadly, pollution, okay? Pollution in the term of CO2, all right? So these are these greenhouse gases that they emit into the atmosphere. This is, let's call it before the Paris Accords. This is what's taking place. Again, businesses take resources, they create products, we buy them, and we pay some fee for them, and these businesses have been polluting. Now, has anything changed post the Paris Accords? And let's use the date 2030, as this is supposed to be an important date per the Paris Accords. So what happens here? Here again, I'm going to draw the same circle. We have the businesses, and let's put the year now 2030. And what occurs in 2030? These businesses still exist, let's say. Again, these are the businesses. And they are creating products, as I mentioned before, to us as consumers. Same situation. This is, again, you and me. And these consumers pay some fee for these products. And guess what? They're still polluting. And I'll give you some numbers on this. In fact, they're polluting a lot more.
So right there, right, between now and 2030, the only thing that has changed is that we're polluting more. Now, first of all, the pollution aspect of this, CO2, by the scale from what, we're polluting into the atmosphere, is nothing. There's billions and billions of tons of methane that escape from the ice as it melts, that would have way more of an effect than any CO2 would. But the only thing is, the ice is only melting because the temperature of the ocean is actually warming up. And because the temperature of the ocean is warming up, ice is actually calving off back in. Fresh water is going back into the ocean, which actually allows for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere to freeze even faster. So keep that in mind.
We'll see. But something very interesting happens. For the pollution they do, they have to now pay an organization, which I'm going to call, in double quotes, the IPCC. And this group is composed of people like Al Gore, people like the Bushes, many people from the commodities market, and essentially a global elite in here.
So right there, Al Gore and Bush. Those are just two names that he throws out, but obviously Barack Obama was the poster child for the Paris Climate Accord. It was the whole reason that he fervently campaigned for Hillary Clinton, because he knew that if Hillary Clinton got in, the IPCC would have succeeded in imposing a global carbon tax, which would have benefited China and Russia. Unbelievable. And all the global elites were involved in some form or another.
Quote-unquote scientists. A dollar goes here, dollars go in, and these people deliver these people something called carbon credits. And what this allows these companies to do now is to pollute, but in order to pollute, they have to pay this organization a fee, and this organization issues carbon credits. In fact, it gets even more interesting. These carbon credits, if you look at the commodities market, the global commodities market, these carbon credits are bought and sold here on this commodities market.
Another thing, the commodities market, if you put carbon credits on the commodities market, you're basically looking at you can sell carbon credits to the highest bidder, and if anybody owns them, if some big corporation, if there's not enough carbon credits, and let's say you have the only carbon credit for sale, you could sell it for $100 billion if that's what it takes. And so they were basically trying to exacerbate the price of the carbon credits in the commodity markets
to people. And this generates the ability for this group to generate trillions, not billions, let me explain, trillions of dollars in new source of wealth. So these carbon credits were created by this group as a vehicle to essentially charge polluters something, and this group has the potential to make trillions and trillions of dollars. So how did this all happen, and what was the Paris Accords? Well, the front end for this entire organization, by the way, Al Gore substantially, at a certain point, monopolized, had access to a large number of carbon credits, which he had accumulated, and his goal was to have a payday by forcing these businesses in the future, around post-2030, to buy these carbon credits. And if you actually look at this, the IPCC's PR, I call it their PR machine, was what we call the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords was really their PR engine to get this out as though everyone needed to get on board.
So when you heard all those people like, oh shit, Macron is, became the president, they were like, because supposedly he was a Rothschild banker. And look, the Rothschild family is kind of like a boogeyman as far as I'm concerned. Like, I don't really see them as a threat because everybody just blames the Rothschilds. It's like, we don't even know if the fucking Rothschilds even do anything. It almost seems like mysteries of the internet at this point. But Paris would have been the central command of all this. One of the largest gas companies supply clean energy is actually a French company. It's called Air Liquide, and they are one of the largest distributors of hydrogen fuel in the world. So I think during a transition phase, when you transition, especially like in California, there's a lot of initiatives so you can buy, green energy. You get extra tax return shit for buying a electric vehicle or a hybrid or whatever. So eventually government would have subsidized it to make it easier to transition over to hydrogen, which is a clean fuel, which would probably be controlled by, in the majority of it would have been controlled by France, who also bought the United States' largest gas distributor, air gas. So France would have had a major control on, much like Saudi Arabia had over the last, 50 plus years, which is something that nobody talks about. So, just another thing to keep in mind.
And what the U.S., if you look at the United States here, put the flag here, the U.S. Was being forced by the IPCC. By the way, this included establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans, who were essentially telling the U.S. government that it needed to create what we call a green fund. And this green fund, and I'll explain what this was really about, the U.S. was going to have to put $100 billion into this green fund. And what was this $100 billion for? Well, remember, the countries who are polluting really didn't want to be part of this. They didn't really want to be part of the Paris Accords. Why? Because they have to pay fees to the IPCC. So how do you get them to be part of this? So if I do this over here, what I call the influencers of these countries, influencers of countries. So for example, if you take India, China, and you go down the list of what they call about 190 plus countries, remember all these people have influencers, so-called advisors. This $100 billion number was going to be funneled through different NGOs to essentially pay off, and in fact, people had already gotten agreements that if they joined the Paris Accords, that they're going to get dollars funneled to them. This is why people were involved in this. In fact, some of the WikiLeaks stuff came out. Jairam Ramesh, one of the key advisors in India, originally, if you go look at it, he said that the glaciers were not receding, and later on it was stated that the glaciers were receding. And in a recent email in WikiLeaks, he was actually thanking John Podesta for making all of this occur. So you have to really start thinking about what took place. But fundamentally, Trump wanted to exit this because I think Trump realized what was really going on. And what was really going on is this.
So what he just said there, WikiLeaks, in the WikiLeaks, he was thanking John Podesta. I mean, come on. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's like, the time immemorial, good versus evil, the battle of the century, and it's unfolding right in front of our eyes, and this guy is basically just laying it out for us. So, God, look at this. What he has done, and look at it. He tried to make it as simple as possible, and yet it still looks like a ridiculous, flow chart. But anyways, I'm gonna let him finish here.
Mafia of the IPCC was using the United States instrument, our Congress, our tax dollars, to funnel about $100 billion here, so we would pay off these people to join the Paris Accords. Now, let me just tell you, $100 billion is a relatively small amount. Unreal. Because these guys were going to make trillions. So let me follow this through again so you get it. Businesses today are polluting. Just to give you an example, China today pollutes around 11 billion tons of carbon.
Before he gets into that, this chart over here basically is all the countries, which I think he said 190 something, that would have been paid out by the U.S. taxpayers. So there's that.
into the atmosphere. Carbon, 11 billion tons of carbon. That's what they're doing today. By 2030, or between now and 2030, guess what? China's still allowed to pollute. In fact, China is allowed to go up to 22 billion tons, which means they're allowed to go 11 billion tons in carbon, which means they're going to pollute more. They're going to double their pollution during this period. No penalties. And that's how they got China to join. After 2030, there's going to be a big payday for these guys because they're going to be able to sell China carbon credits. I hope everyone's following. The bottom line is these set of 190, in many ways, so-called influencers and advisors, many of them essentially are waiting for this $100 billion payday, supported the Paris Accords because they're going to be paid, and that's how they force their countries' prime ministers and people to say, yeah, we got to join this Paris Accords. The reality is when you step back and look at this diagram, who really profits is the who are going to make money on carbon credits that they fluctuate and rapidly grow in price post-2030. So a $100 billion payout to most of these corrupt officials, it's very well worth it for them because they're going to have a 1,000%, 100 to 1,000% increase in profits. So fundamentally, what Donald Trump did was he saw the scam, which is what it is. And fundamentally what this does is makes liberal bourgeois feel good that they're part of the Paris Accords. In fact, the MIT president has said, you know, we have conclusive evidence that temperature has gone up. Let me just make it very clear that Hansen, the guy who came up with this temperature rating at NASA, you know, during the 1950s to 1990, they used what they said was the average temperature, 1998, during that period. That's how they measured the average temperature. And they said the average temperature was 15 degrees Celsius. And they predicted in 1990, around 1988, that temperature was going to go up. So again, in 1988, papers are starting to come out saying the average temperature measured between 1950 to 1980 is 15 degrees, and they're saying, you know, temperature is going to rise on the planet Earth. Well, what happens? By 1995, 1996, they find out the temperature actually, in fact, gone down a little bit. It was not going up. And somehow, mysteriously, around 2002, Hansen says, yes, the temperature has gone up. And how did he get it to go up? He got it to go up by saying that the average temperature is now 14 degrees. He actually changed the goalpost. Before it's 15, he said now it's 14, and he said we're measuring 14.64.
So they basically just changed the temperature manually and made some fraudulent data. And I know I pretty much played the whole video here, but I mean, this is a very impressive video that just lays it out so good. He did such a good job laying it out for people that just didn't really understand the whole concept of what was really going on with this IPCC and so-called climate change. So, I don't know why this won't exit out. Hang on a second here.
It did was a complete lie.
Hang on a second.
And in fact, this changing of the goalpost was done in an email. All of this is written in a beautiful article.
This is the average temperatures for what was this, November 11th. If you look at that, that's so far below average. That's literally, I mean, in the 18 to 20 degree range in the gray areas, and in the blue areas up to minus 14 degrees Celsius difference. I mean, you might as well have just pushed the Arctic from Russia into the United States and replaced pushed the low pressure cold over from Russia. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is Russia. This is actually the snowfall. I don't know how well you guys can see that. I wish I could blow this up, but basically, this this area here, this is where the Arctic Circle is. This is like the coldest area. Obviously, you can see the snow area, but think about if Russia has obviously they had what they call the Russian woodpecker, and they were actually able to manipulate the weather in the United States back in the 80s. And there's a lot of parallels to the 80s to what's happening right now. And so imagine Russia, somewhere out here in Siberia, they create a massive high pressure. They just radiate the absolute shit out of the upper atmosphere, and they create a high pressure to the extent that it pushes cold air into lower latitudes of the United States. I know it sounds crazy, but it's just how I am. Now, the other thing, the last thing I want to talk about here is this, which is the precipitation anomaly. This is only the last 60 days, but that's still, I mean, this is kind of somewhat of a rain, like the season where we're supposed to start getting rain, and we've literally had none. I have had 0 days of rain, basically all year, it seems. And for those of you that don't know, there are many ways to contribute to lack of rainfall, which is you can rain embargo, which was done back in the 60s by the CIA to Cuba, which is a documented case among others. But California, the reason the fires are gone off is because of there's literally no moisture. I mean, it's so dry and so dusty. It doesn't surprise me that 250,000 or whatever it was acres, and it just goes literally like wildfire. And what you have to understand is California, among other places around the world, they go through cycles, and those cycles involve, unfortunately, wildfires, drought, natural disasters that, can unfortunately sometimes can't be avoided. But, the Indians, when they would come through, they would backburn. As they were leaving, they just light shit on fire, let it go, and then when they came back, all the nutrients that would go back into the soil would create new growth. And that's one thing that we never or we always take for granted, is the wisdom of the people that were here before us, who had lived here for probably thousands of years before we ever came over here. And they might have seemed crazy for the things that they did, but there was always a reason. And it was embedded in their culture. This is another article that I found, Popular Science. I actually found it from Daniel Swain, Weather West. He had this article posted, and it's the 5 years of California fires. So this is how much of the state has actually burned, which is a lot of it. It doesn't, I mean, it's a lot, basically. So IPCC. California is built to burn and burn explosively. The dry heat, the droughts, the expanses of land that actually rely on regular wildfires to regenerate. It's a deadly recipe. Of course, it's not just the West Coast. Wildfires burned all over the world last year. South Africa, New Zealand, Russia, Canada, Brazil were all ablaze at various points. The current Mendocino complex fire will hopefully be contained by August. Okay, so this is an old article, but still, look at that. So, anyways, I hope you guys learned something from this video. Share it far and wide, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.